It is one of the most frequently asked questions about the sinking of the RMS Titanic. Did the Titanic's stern implode while it was heading to the bottom of the ocean? I myself have said that I believe it did multiple times throughout multiple videos, and I base this assumption on several factors. The first of which is due to the fact that the stern sank very quickly when you compare it to the bow section, while there was still a lot of air trapped inside the stern after it left the surface. And the second reason I thought this was due to the fact that survivors said that they heard what they thought were underwater explosions after the Titanic's stern left the surface. Even though the survivors said explosions, I took this to mean implosions. They just didn't know what they were hearing at the time. However, as many of you on YouTube have pointed out in the comments section every single time this topic comes up, you've stated that there is no way the Titanic stern could have imploded due to the fact that it wasn't completely sealed up like a submarine would be. So, if this is the case, then what is the correct answer? Well, I decided to look into it for today's video and try to answer this question once and for all. Let's get into it. Special thanks to Titanic Honor and Glory for providing the sinking animation you're going to see in today's video. Please check out their work in the description below. Okay, so to start off with, let's first discuss exactly what the Titanic stern did during the sinking, and then we can go from that and try to build an assumption on what it might have done after it left the surface. You see, during the final stages of the sinking of the Titanic, where the ship's bow was completely filled with water at this point, it was trying to drop down to the bottom of the ocean. However, due to the Titanic's watertight compartments, the stern, which by this point was still full of air and almost completely dry, was rising up higher and higher into the air as the bow sank deeper. Now, eventually, the Titanic's hull could not take this strain anymore, and the ship broke in two. When this happened, the bow broke away from the stern and basically just headed to the bottom of the ocean. It was just dead weight, completely filled with water, or nearly filled with water, so yeah, that's pretty much it for the bow. However, where the stern was still more or less completely dry, and it did have its own watertight compartments in it, which all of the ones close to the breakup area were compromised by the breakup, so the stern was definitely going to sink. But the stern still had to go through its own sinking scenario. So as the forward part of the stern flooded and began to sink down into the water, the back part of the stern, which was still, more or less watertight, it began to rise higher and higher into the air. Now, it's important to remember that all of the Titanic's watertight compartments were not completely sealed off. They were open at the top. Now, if you don't know this, this wasn't a design flaw with the ship. They were actually designed this way on purpose, and they would, under normal circumstances, keep the Titanic from sinking. However, I'm not going to be going into all of that stuff in this video. I already covered this topic extensively in other videos. If you would like to learn more about that, I will have a link to those videos in the description below. So, due to the fact that the stern still had all of these watertight bulkheads within it, even though they would not prevent the stern from sinking, they would delay the stern sinking, at least for a time, because the water would have to flood each compartment before it moved on into the next one. So, because of this, all of the watertight compartments in the forward part of the stern flooded first, and this caused the front to sink down deeper and deeper. However, because the water couldn't reach the compartments in the back of the stern kept rising higher and higher into the air. It actually climbed up so high that the stern was basically sticking up completely vertical out of the water. Some of the survivors later said that the stern looked like a giant finger pointing up into the sky. Now, even though the watertight bulkheads prevented the water from reaching some parts of the stern, the areas that it could get to, it was flooding rapidly and destroying everything that was in its path. As I previously stated, this wasn't a slow, gradual flooding like what the bow went through. It was rapid and it was very destructive. Eventually, so much water made its way into the stern that the stern slowly began to slip beneath the surface. Now, when this happened, all of the trapped air inside the stern, the pressure began to increase rapidly. And the deeper the stern got, since the water hadn't reached all of those interior spaces yet, the air began to try to escape the stern any way that it could. Porthole windows began to burst. Some of the decking in the stern began to blow out. I mean, it was a very violent and very destructive event. Some of the Titanic survivors that were still clinging to the stern during its final plunge were actually blown clear of the ship as the air inside began to rapidly and explosively escape. Now, even with all of this air explosively leading the Titanic, there inevitably would be some places where the air couldn't get out and it would be trapped within the Titanic. After the Titanic's stern left the surface, these spaces would become known as air pockets. And these are areas where the air is and the water hadn't reached yet. If you want to know exactly where I think these would have most likely formed, probably in the aftmost parts of the Titanic stern section. So the further aft you go, in this area right here, the further away you go from the breakup area, the more likely there would be air pockets to form after the Titanic slipped beneath the surface. Now, here's the thing to remember about air pockets. Just because you have an air pocket form inside of a sunken vessel, that doesn't necessarily mean that an implosion is going to occur. In fact, there's several different things that could happen to an air pocket inside of a sunken vessel, depending on all of the other factors that are affecting it. So what we're going to be doing in this video from this point on is discuss several different scenarios that could have happened to the air pockets within the Titanic stern. And then from that, we're going to try to hypothesize if an implosion-like scenario is possible. Okay, so the first scenario we're going to discuss is, let's assume that there is a watertight compartment within the Titanic stern and water has completely flooded this compartment, but there's one tiny space within it that has an air pocket and the water can't get to it because the air is keeping it out, all right? So the water pressure and the air pressure within that air pocket are basically the same, all right? Well, as the ship continues to sink deeper and deeper into the sea, the water pressure continues to increase. And when this happens, it puts more and more pressure on the air pocket, and the air pocket basically begins to shrink. And what would happen is, as the ship goes down deeper and deeper, the air pocket would get smaller and smaller until eventually it just dissolved away and the water consumed everything. Or if it sank fast enough, this air pocket could simply collapse. This isn't an implosion, mind you, but it's a little bit similar. If there was a poor soul trapped within an air pocket when this happened, well, it wouldn't be a nice death, okay? Like, you would find like your eardrums would pop, you would feel all the pressure increasing all around you, you would find it harder and harder to breathe as it was more and more work to get each breath, and then yeah, you would either drown or be crushed when the air pocket collapsed. Definitely not a good way to go. So here's the thing to remember about implosions. For an implosion to occur, there needs to be a difference between the outside pressure and the inside pressure. This is why implosions are most common in sealed up vessels like submarines, okay? So in an implosion scenario, let's take a look at the Titan submersible for an example here, okay? As the Titan sub sank down deeper and deeper into the sea, or descended down, I should say, as the water pressure on the outside continued to build up and build up, eventually on the Titan sub, there was one point where the structure failed. And then all of that weight, because on the outside, I believe it's like 300 atmospheres of pressure at Titanic's depth, but inside the Titan sub, it's 1 atmosphere. Well, imagine all of that weight and all that pressure coming in all at once. That's an implosion, okay? And that is very crucial for an implosion to occur. Now, in the scenario that I just gave off, where the pressure in the air pocket and the water pressure were the same, this can't happen. And it's very uncommon for this to happen in a sunken ship because there aren't really that many sealed up spaces. However, this can happen somewhat in a sunken ship if there is a partially sealed off area. So let's say you've got a space within a sunken ship, aka Titanic, okay, and it's partially sealed off. So it's not completely sealed off like a submarine, but just partially, all right? Even though a implosion in the truest sense of the word can't happen, you can have an implosion-like event occur where some areas get crushed. Now, here's the ultimate question. Was there a space on the Titanic where this could be possible? Well, to answer your question, yes. Yes, there is. You see, just aft of the Titanic's fourth funnel, and on both the G deck and the orlop deck, this is where the Titanic's refrigeration storage rooms were located. It was here where the Titanic's crew kept all of the perishable items that were stored on the ship. Now, these areas weren't completely sealed off. They were ventilated, and they did this so they had temperature control in these spaces. Yeah, listen, the engineering behind these refrigeration storage areas is really crazy and impressive. Believe it or not, they had their own massive engines that actually ran the refrigeration in there, and these were down in the engine room. I've got a picture of one of those engines up right now. I mean, you can see how it compares to that man right there. Pretty cool stuff. But yeah, anyway. These spaces, while they were ventilated, they were more sealed up than the other spaces around them. So in my opinion, I think it's entirely possible that this area, well, I don't think the water would have been able to get to it very quickly. If it had enough time to slowly flood the Titanic stern, yes, I do think these spaces would have flooded evenly eventually. However, due to how rapidly the stern sank, I do think that it went down so fast that it was sealed up enough to cause a pressure difference to occur within those spaces and the outside water pressure. So as the Titanic stern continued to sink deeper and deeper into the sea, I do think it's entirely possible that these refrigeration spaces could have indeed imploded, at least somewhat. So in conclusion, do I think the Titanic stern imploded after it sank? Well, yes and no. I think it's possible that some spaces on the stern imploded, but it's very apparent from looking at the wreck that the entire stern didn't implode. Most of the damage to the stern section you see on the wreck today was caused by this weird spiraling thing that the stern did as it was free falling to the bottom of the ocean. However, just because this is the case, that doesn't mean that no spots on the stern imploded. I do think that there could have been some small implosion-like events here and there on the stern, in the refrigeration spaces as an example. Now, in regards to the sounds that some of the survivors on the surface said that they heard after the Titanic stern sank, well, I think a lot of this, while they could have been implosions, we do know from the Titan submersible disaster that implosion sounds can be heard on the surface. Don't forget, Stockton Rush's wife heard the Titan sub implode. I think it's I think it's possible that the survivors heard some implosions, but I also think they heard just the ship ripping itself apart as it fell to the bottom of the ocean. They may have heard some of the air explosively ejecting itself from the stern as it sank. They could have heard some of the steel and the hull ripping apart as it fell. There's a lot of things that the survivors could have heard, not just implosions. But yeah, in conclusion, yes and no. It just depends on how you look at it. But ultimately, I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you guys think that the Titanic stern imploded? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.